All right, well, welcome back. We'll get going here. Um, so today is April 12th, um, a red letter day in history. It was on this date in 352 that Pope St. Julius died. Pope St. Julius, who was, and I only say that because one of his claims to fame is that he was a defender of Athanasius. And Athanasius is one of my favorite people in church history because he was excommunicated 5 times and managed to keep coming back, you know, kept coming back for it. And one of the reasons he was able to come back was because he had Pope St. Julius defending him. He was instrumental. Athanasius is very influential in the New Testament canon as far as why the books. He was kind of the guy that sort of arranged that. So today in 1204, the Fourth Crusade occupied and plundered Constantinople. So the Fourth Crusade, this was that ostensible period of time when the uh, Christian West was going to travel to the Holy Land and reclaim it from the Islamics that were controlling it at the time. The Fourth Crusade never made it to the Holy Land. They decided to land in Constantinople, which was at the time ostensibly a Christian city. And they occupied it and took it over and raped and pillaged for 3 days and desecrated the Hagia Sophia, the Christian church built by Constantine back in the day. Um, so yeah, it's oh, here they come. So that was in 1204. In 1525, Catholic Mass was said for the last time in Zurich. Okay, this is just prior to the I don't know if I want to call it the takeover, but the John Calvin came in and took over the area, and so that was the last time. In 1557, just 30 years later, 5 Protestant converts are burned at the stake in England as a result of the reign of Mary Tudor. Okay, so I've talked about Mary Tudor. This is Bloody Mary. Okay, so you have to keep track of who's Bloody Mary and Mary Queen of Scots, and so she started in 1787. The Free African Society was formed. This was created by Richard Allen, who was the pastor of what Bethel Methodist Church, or Mother Bethel, as it's referred to. We did a trip to Philadelphia where we got a tour, and Richard Allen. There's a church. It's the first and longest continuously operating church in the U.S. is Mother Bethel called, and Richard Allen is interred in the basement of it. There's a room, and then there it is, and there's like a museum down there. It's really pretty cool, kind of thing. But the Free African Society was formed, which included Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who is one of the other founders of Mother Bethel as well. In 1850, Adoniram Judson died. Adoniram Judson, who missionary to India, Burma. And I always want to point out that the Harrises, Nina Harris. Anybody remember Nina Harris? She was Nina Harris. She's related to Adoniram Judson, distantly great nephew or niece. Liverpool, I would guess, but I don't know that for a fact.
Wasn't he the first American?
Why? Yeah, I mean,
Wasn't he the first American
missionary.
missionary?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So he wouldn't have come out of Liverpool.
Salem, Massachusetts.
Okay. But he died on this date in 1851. In 1861, today is the date of the Battle of Fort Sumter. Battle of Fort Sumter, and that started the Civil War. In 1924, WLS AM went on the air. 89 W. Okay, now we know what you guys were all listening to back in the day, kind of thing. So in 1938, the Chicago Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup. they've won it since then. So it's not like that was the last time. But what's interesting is that is the only time a team has won the Stanley Cup with a losing record of the season. I don't know how they did it, but they did it. That was in 1938. In 1945, FDR died on this date, and then Harry Truman took over. It's kind of an interesting story. If you kind of read that, it's like everybody knew around him. Everybody knew going into the election of 1944 that FDR didn't have long for the war. I mean, his health was that bad, and everybody knew that, and they still kind of picked Harry Truman. Just it was sort of a compromise, and he was just a first term senator from Missouri that they figured would pacify some of the more incalcitrant members of the Democratic Party. And so he literally was just brought in. They just figured and was kind of said, here, you've got an office over there. And the irony of that is he was kept in the dark about a lot of stuff that was going on. He was given ceremonial duties, even though the people surrounding FDR knew FDR was not going to make it, kind of thing. And so he dies, of course, and then basically they bring Harry Truman in and say, hey, guess what? You got some decisions to make. We got this big bomb. What do you want to do with it? Sort of stuff. And finally, it was on this date in 1954 that Bill Haley recorded Rock Around the Clock, which of course we all remember as the theme song to what TV show? Happy Days. Happy Days. It was a big hit before then, but it was recorded on this date in 1954. So a lot of good stuff on this date. It's also Debbie's sister's birthday today, so we're gonna just so that's we always celebrate those birthdays. No, we don't. I wouldn't have known had Debbie said, yeah, it's also my sister's birthday today on the way in, kind of thing. So yeah, she was born in Argentina, right? And her brother was born in Argentina. Debbie is the perfect American in the family. She's the one born in the U.S. So, all right. Today we're going to talk about the Book of Chronicles. The Book of Chronicles. Let me pull out our handout for the day. Oh, sorry, Liz. No, I'm just kidding. So it's like I'm ignoring you. I go to the one on the right, to the left. All right. Let's open with a word of prayer, and then we'll get going. Our Father, I'm thankful for all that you've done for us. Thank you for this day. Thank you for the chance we have to be here. Pray your blessing on the service to come. Be with Pastor Jared as he preaches. Pray that you would give us a challenge from your word. Give us a good time here today. Help us to learn and to be challenged from your word as well. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Chronicles. So the question is, what is the final book of the Hebrew Old Testament? Obviously, this is a very leading question, given that we're talking about Chronicles. So anybody want to guess what the final book of the Hebrew Old Testament is? The final book of the Hebrew Old Testament is the Book of Chronicles. In fact, and I forgot to look up the passage, but there's a verse in the New Testament where somebody says, from the death of Abel to the death of Jehoiakim, or something like that, or A to Z, or something like that, and it's the first person to die in the Hebrew Bible, and the last person to die in the Book of Chronicles, and it's one of the verses that's used to kind of show the completeness of the Old Testament canon. So yeah, the Book of Chronicles is the last, and again, as with Samuel and Kings, Chronicle was originally a single book. Okay, it was originally a single book, as was next week we're going to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, because in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah are the same book. Now they combined they split Chronicles because in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, it wouldn't fit on a single scroll. So they had the first scroll of Chronicles and the second scroll of Chronicles. They had the first scroll of Kings, the second scroll of Kings, um, kind of thing. Um, so uh, now why they combined Ezra and Nehemiah, the Hebrew Bible, why they didn't split Ezra and Nehemiah, I don't know. But Ezra and Nehemiah in the Hebrew Bible, so we're going to deal with it. It does kind of tell the same story or different sides of the same story. So next week we'll talk about that. The Septuagint, that is the LXX. So when you see the letters LXX, that's the standard universal abbreviation for the Septuagint. And the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And that was done around 200 BC. Okay, so the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. So the Bible that would have been used during Jesus' time would more than likely have been the Septuagint. Okay, not the Hebrew Bible. It would have been the Greek Bible, or certainly Paul would have used the Greek Bible, the Septuagint. And what's interesting about that, and is again, I'm going to repeat this over and over again, that the first complete canon we have of the Old Testament in Hebrew is called the Masoretic text, but that doesn't come until about 800 AD, which is kind of an interesting thing. It's like, okay, and one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of copies of the Hebrew canon is because they were much more careful both in copying and dealing with old copies than the Greek New Testament was. And what I mean by that is that if they had a copy of the book of Genesis or the Pentateuch and it got wore out, they would destroy it. Okay, the priests would destroy it. Whereas when, if they had a copy of Matthew, it wasn't destroyed. It was just put on a shelf and forgotten about. So that's why we have hundreds of manuscripts of New Testament documents, not so much of the Old Testament. They're out there, but I'm just saying they're not quite as many. But it's divided up differently. The Hebrew Bible is divided differently. There's the law, there's the prophets, and there's the writings. Whereas we have the Pentateuch, the history, the poetic books. Kind of the English Bible is separated, organized differently. And the Book of Chronicles is the last book in that thing. So if you pick up a Hebrew Bible, the very last book, which will be at the front, because it goes from right to left, it'll be the Book of Chronicles. Okay. The Hebrew title to the book is the Word of the Days, and that comes from a passage in 2 Chronicles 27:24. Now the English I'm sorry, that's not right. 27, because there is no 2 Chronicles 27:24. Well, take my word for it. There's a verse in, maybe it's 1 Chronicles 27:24. Let me see. 27:24. Job began to, perhaps in 1 Chronicles 27:24, Joab, son of Zeruiah, began to count the men, but did not finish. God's wrath came on Israel on account of this numbering, and the number was not entered into the book of the annals of King David. So maybe that's what my source was looking for. But it's called the Words of the Days. The Septuagint, again, the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, calls this book. Does anybody want to guess what the Greek translation or the Greek title of the book is? You got the first two letters. The Things Omitted. It's called The Things Omitted, which is kind of an interesting thought, that in looking at the writing of Chronicles, and that is, and let me drop down a couple here. The author unknown. Tradition suggests it's Ezra. Hebrew tradition says it's Ezra, or the author of Ezra, the book. Should be a comma there. Tradition suggests it is Ezra, or the author of Ezra, the book, is also the author of Chronicles, the book. I know that's a poorly punctuated sentence. Apologies to the English majors in the room. I'm going to hear about this all afternoon. You know what bugged me? You know. So somebody wrote Ezra, the book of Ezra, and we'll talk about this next week. So you think that it's Ezra that wrote Ezra, which may be, but whoever wrote Ezra may have also written Chronicles. Okay. The point is, it's apparent that the author was a theologian and a religious teacher. As we get into the theme and what you see in the book of Chronicles, he's a theologian and a religious teacher, because Chronicles, when it comes right down to it, is a religious history. I'm jumping ahead here. Okay. So when you read Chronicles, you think, a lot of this I've heard about. What's changed? What's been omitted? Okay, so what has been omitted? And it was probably among the last books written in the Old Testament canon. That's what I wanted to get to. It was one of the last written. So somebody sat down, looked at Kings and Samuel and Kings, because Samuel and Kings kind of tells, a story, a linear story. Starts with, the end of Judges, and it ends with the return back to the land at the end of Kings. And somebody looked at that and said, and something's missing. Something's not, we need to add some detail that's not in these stories, okay? So Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem. Chronicles ends with an invitation to rebuild, okay? So, I'm sorry, Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem. Chronicles, which again covers the same period of time, okay? But it ends with an instruction, the invitation to rebuild the temple, which is a much more positive. So Kings is kind of depressing. It's like, man, there goes Israel into captivity. What's happening? And Chronicles, the author of Chronicles says, no, wait a minute, it's not that bad. Let's put a more positive spin on it. Let's point out some of the positive elements of it. And they got to go back and rebuild it. Okay. So the writer uses, and one of the things about Chronicles, remember when we talked about Kings, we said that they use like the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, the Chronicles of the history of David, and there were three main sources mentioned in the book. There was a book about David's kingdom, then the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. Okay, Judah being the southern kingdom, Israel being the northern kingdom. Okay, this writer in Chronicles talks about a lot of stuff. There's a lot of sources. I got this from this. I got this from this. So it really is kind of more of a historical survey, in kind of the more classic, like we would look at it, at a historical survey. Okay, I've been, I don't know if anybody's ever read has anybody read like a lot of academic writing? Academic writing is like the worst. I mean, it is the worst. Because when you have to document everything, and you have to make sure everybody knows that you've documented this. And so and then when you're in a field like education, where publishing is one of the ways that you get out of the classroom, write a book about how you did this. You have to write and say, here's what this person said, and this person said, and this person said, and this person said, and you've got the footnotes, and you've got the kind of thing, and you're like, man, get to you're kind of reading. There's a sentence in here somewhere that means something, and I'm going to find it. But you got to wade through all this other stuff to get to the good idea. Or I'm just griping here now. You'll read a book that's what is the I'm trying to get through a book on reflective practice, creating a reflective practice as a way of improving your school success. Okay, and that's based, reflective practice is kind of just essentially looking at it going, all right, how did that go? Did it go well? What can we do better? How do you build this practice? But the authors of this book, there's like 2 or 3 of them, wrote an earlier book, and they keep referring back to the earlier book. As we said in our first book, as we said in our first book, as we said in our first book. I'm like, come on, just tell me what I want to know and quit trying to sell your first book. It's like, if I had bought the first book, I'd be really upset. I'm sorry. Okay, calm down, deep breath. I'm trying to distract my wife from the badly punctuated sentence. You know, she'll say, you could punctuate that better. I say, yes, but I've been reading this book and it's driving me nuts. So, but the author of Chronicles uses a lot of different sources. He uses genealogical records. Here's given some examples. And in fact, if you read Chronicles, okay, the first 9 chapters are just names and places. Names and places, names and places, names and places, names and places. Okay. And it can be interesting. You kind of look at it and say, okay, this is who these people are, this is who these people are. And but if you're kind of looking through the first 9 chapters trying to get you're not going to walk away from that other than just seeing how God has protected his people and created that land, or that people that was as numerous as the sea, or sands on the sea. Yeah. Well, it will be after today. It will be after today. Um, but so the first 9 chapters are just names and dates and places. I mean, it's almost as exciting as reading the second half of Joshua, which is where just maps and lines and borders. Again, remember we talked the second half of Joshua was kind of like reading a map, just sort of somebody reading a map to you. It's like, okay, there's a road, it goes north, and then it makes a left, and then there's another city kind of thing. But he uses genealogical records. He uses letters and documents. Okay. There are poems, prayers, speeches, and songs. Poems, prayers. I wanted to put another P. I wanted to find a promise. Poems and prayers and promises. Poems. That's the John Denver song, but songs. Poems, prayers, speeches, and songs. Other histories, too numerous to mention. I mean, there's a lot of referring to the book of the kings of this or the book of the story of that, and some prophetic writings. Okay, because again, there's got some of the prophets come in. So all of these sources get together to create the book of Chronicles. So the Bible Project video describes the book as a story in search of an ending, which I think is kind of an interesting way to put it. And they talk about the Cyrus at the end of the book, the king of Persia, having sent. Does anybody know, just off the top of your head, what we call the country of Persia now? Iran. Yeah. And so there's supposedly, I've read, I don't know, there's a movement where they're trying to get rid of the name Iran. That was sort of something that came with their westernization. They want to go back to being called Persia. But yeah, if you happen to know somebody from Iran or somebody who's Iranian, they're Persians. They're not Arabs. Just so in case you're in conversation, you see somebody who's Iranian and you go, hey, how are you and your Arab brothers? Don't say that, because they're Persians. They're Persians. So kind of thing. But be that as it may, it described it as a story in search of an ending. But if you think about this, you think about how. So again, the book is called The Things Omitted. In Greek, they look at it and they said, okay, so this author the author of Chronicles, if you think about how it fits in, the author of Chronicles looks at the events, looks at the stories, looks at where the nation is, and says, okay, it's not working. The whole temple idea, the whole Messiah idea, the king idea is not working the way we thought it was going to work. And so we kind of have to rethink that. Okay. We kind of have to rethink how that's going to work. All right. And so, okay, it isn't necessarily that. So you see that this modification in their thinking is already going on by the time Christ appears in the New Testament. And so now, if you think about the points that Christ makes, why is it so important that he's son of David? Why is that repeated over and over again? Okay, why does Christ spend so much time in the temple? Why is that so? Again, we're working with this modification of what the messianic idea is going to look like. Okay, so again, and even at the time, when Jesus comes, the fact that he's modifying and Christianity modifies what that is going to look like, that's not the first time that they've looked at that and thought, okay, how do we make this work, kind of thing. You see what I'm saying here? Um, so even as you look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, et cetera, they're, will you at this point set up your kingdom, kind of thing. How many times has Christ asked that sort of stuff? And when the fact is, he already has. It's just not a kingdom like you think it is, sort of thing. So, um, but basically, the Chronicles. What's really different about Chronicles is the temple history of the nation. It focuses on Jerusalem. Okay, so it focuses on Jerusalem because Jerusalem is where the temple is. Okay, and it talks a lot about the temple and what's going on with the temple. Okay, so Samuel and Kings is more of a political history. I mean, you see the kings, you see how they follow the law. So it's a religious history in that sense, but the temple is not as predominant. And so there was a huge effort. Remember, David wants to build the temple, and God says, "No, your son is going to build the temple." And I get additional information about David includes his preparations for the temple. Okay, so again, if you read Kings and you see and Samuel and you see Kings, you get the idea that David said he had a conversation with God one day and said, "Hey, God, I want to build a temple." And God said, "No, your son's going to build a temple." And David said, "All right, I'm going to move on to my next thing," kind of thing. When that's not exactly how it happened. Okay, so what David does, and if you read Chronicles, you see David goes through a lot of effort to prepare the groundwork for doing the temple. Okay, it kind of reminds me of how the walls get painted at Shea Ray. Okay, so we haven't done this in a while. Okay, and I'm going to put this idea in her head, and now suddenly we're going to go home today and she goes, maybe we should repaint the walls in here. So it's my own fault, right? But so we're going to paint the walls in the kitchen. And the last time we did this, what happened was we we decided what color the wall was going to be. So okay, got the color. Now we're going to paint the wall. And so I go into the kitchen and I move everything away from the walls. I go and I remove all of the pictures off the wall, the paintings off the wall. I make sure there's no dust on the wall. I fix all the little holes in the wall with the spackle and the holes and the things like that. I get the drop cloth out. I put the drop cloth down. I put the ladder down. So here's where the ladder is. I get the paint out, get the paintbrush, and then Debbie walks out, hands me the paintbrush. I clean the paintbrush. I put the paint away. I put the ladder away. I take the drop cloths off. I put the pictures back on the wall. I put everything back on the wall. And then when credit is given as far as who painted the walls, Debbie did.
That's true. That's true.
Kind of thing, and so to a certain extent, this is what happens. Okay, David is calling up people and saying, "Okay, this is a serious project. We got to get the plans. We got to get the location." Or he got the location at the end of Samuel. That's that threshing floor in 2 Samuel 28, where he buys a. He gets the material, he gets the plans, he hires the people, he gets everything ready to go. And then when Solomon becomes the king, all he's got to do is do the ceremonial ribbon cutting, and boom, off they go. They start to, or get the shovel. You've seen the picture where the person in the middle, it's a shovel and this group kind of around. Solomon only has to do that, and boom, they start to work on the temple. And so it's called Solomon's Temple, just like this is Debbie's kitchen. Okay. I can look fondly and go, yeah, I remember moving that wall back and moving this kind of, but it doesn't matter, kind of thing. So, so it's a focus on the temple. It's a focus on that aspect and that centrality of the temple. Okay, and so again, you can understand that this is something that was very important and becomes very important in the psyche of the religious universe at that time, which is why when Paul is writing in Corinthians, He's like, no, your body is the temple now. Okay. And so you think of the preparation and the work that went into the temple, and now it's like your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. Okay. That temple is no good anymore, but he's got to really deal with this because this is a very central point at the time. So the Chronicles, temple history, it virtually ignores the divided kingdom. Okay, so again, in northern Israel, it's just, because, and why not? I think, it virtually ignores the divided kingdom that is Israel, and why not? The northern kingdom ignores the temple. Remember what Rehoboam did? No, Jeroboam. Jeroboam realizes in Kings, he says, "Hey, I can't be the king of northern Israel and have all of my people going to um, Jerusalem in order to worship." And so he sets up alternate worship places in Dan and Shiloh. What he said? Pardon me. One of them's in Dan, but he sets up two alternate with golden calves. Remember? And we said that it probably wasn't set up as an alternate or an alternative god, like worship this calf. It was just calling back, oh, this is where you don't have to go to the temple anymore. You can go here and give your do your worship to God. Okay, and again, creating these high places. These high places were places where sometimes they were set up in order to worship the God of the Old Testament. Yahweh, they weren't necessarily idolatrous. Now, a lot of times they were, don't get me wrong. The Asherah poles and the Baal worship and all of that. Okay. But sometimes they were just other locations to worship God in. Okay. And this is one of and again, we know from Samuel and Kings that one of the points of the tabernacle and one of the points of the temple was to centralize worship. Okay, that God wanted everyone coming to this one location. He wanted the nation of Israel to come to the temple, and if you read through Isaiah and some of the prophets, that all of the nations were going to come to Jerusalem to worship. That was kind of the city set upon a hill and all that. That's all. They're all going to come to Jerusalem. So even doing this so-called right thing of setting up these, what Jeroboam is doing was clearly calculated to keep away from that centrality of worship sort of thing. And so he's putting it back, the writer is putting that back into the theme. Okay, so the Northern Kingdom. So the book is specifically designed to assure covenant faith. Okay, so it focuses on the temple, which was part of God's presence. God is dwelling amongst them. This is part of the covenant. It's talking about David, with whom the covenant is given. Again, remember, David's covenant is that I will not leave you. You will be the king. You will have a successor on the throne forever. Okay, Saul didn't have that covenant. Okay, so Saul was like, if you obey me, you'll be fine. He didn't obey him. Saul lost the kingdom. Okay, the covenant with David, and we talked about this with Samuel, was I will be with you forever, regardless of what you do. And as we went through Samuel, we saw David did his best to break the covenant. Okay, I mean, he really worked at it, but God was faithful through that. Okay, and then again, the things omitted. The writer's going, hey, there needs to be some detail about the the temple in there. Now, nowadays people, and this is pretty much any historical figure. If you follow them, every once in a while you'll see a new biography of some historical figure, a new biography of Millard Fillmore. Supposedly one of the worst presidents ever. Okay, ineffective on a number of levels. In fact, there's actually a Millard Fillmore Society, kind of appreciation for Millard Fillmore. Or look at Richard III, the King Richard III. Okay, Richard III was King of England for only 2 years, a little over 2 years, 3 years, something like that, and had a horrible reputation for a long time. He wasn't even included in the list of the official list of the kings of England. Okay, so again, if you've ever seen, there's one of Shakespeare's great plays is Richard III. Okay, this is where the line a horse, my kingdom for a horse" comes from. Um, and this is where the story of the two princes in the tower, whereas Shakespeare makes Richard III to be just a tremendous villain, great villain, wonderful villain. It's a great play. You know, you really and he just kind of really connives his way in and becomes king and all of that. And um, sort of thing. And so that sort of shaped the view of King Richard III for decades, centuries, kind of thing. But in this century, or I should say, probably starting in the 20th century, but certainly into the 21st century, there's been a lot of scholarly reappraisal of King Richard III to the point of where, they if you've ever seen the video about how they found his body in a parking lot in England, um, dug it up and found it, and then there was they wanted to bury him there, but they wanted to get like the official imprimatur, is that the right word? Um, they needed to get the official seal. Like when you bury a king, there's an official, or king or queen, there's an official seal. And at first, the Queen Elizabeth said, no, that's Richard III. We're not, But there was a big reclaiming, saying, oh, there are things omitted that we need to know about. Okay, there's things omitted. Like Richard III, I think was the first was the first ruler to create what we would call today a special education approach to school education, recognizing that some kids are doing. That started with Richard III, this supposedly evil king. And so looking at these other things, that narrative, and so here the writer of Chronicles is looking back and go, okay, there's some things we need to focus that the temple was a big deal during then, and the temple was a big deal to David. Okay, he didn't just forget about it. Okay, so and that David is the exemplar of what a king should be, so much so that they want to uh, when Christ comes, he's constantly referred to as son of David, son of David, son of David. That this you are of the line of David. Okay, so what are the major themes? So per the Bible Project video, the hope for the Messianic King and the hope for a renewed temple. Okay, and again, we're going to find out that the first temple was destroyed, but then when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, we're going to find out that there is a temple that is rebuilt. But there's a great verse there, because the second temple is not as big or as glorious as the first temple was. Okay, and there's some there are some people who note that, and we'll get into that story. And then Herod comes in the before Christ is born, and kind of refreshes it. Puts new carpet, new speakers, big screen in the back. And people go, whoa, it's all new, kind of thing. No, so that Herod's temple becomes this big deal. But the first temple, or the second temple, the first version of that second temple was not. But then worship in the Old Testament. How does worship work, specifically in the temple? Okay, and the last thing I just want to point out is we've talked about the chiastic structure of the book and how the stories balance each other out. And rather than going through the whole thing, the chiastic structure of this book has the reign of Solomon, that is 2 Chronicles chapters 1 through 9, as the center, and specifically the central point is the temple dedication. So that the whole, and again with the chiastic structure, I'm trying not to do 2-page handouts. So the chiastic structure has the different stories balancing off, leading to the central point that in the literary approach, they would have said, okay, this is what this is all about, that temple dedication. So it is all about the temple when it comes down to the Book of Chronicles, sort of thing. our main verse there is at the bottom. Says, God is speaking to Solomon. Says, "If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever." Promise given to Solomon at the dedication of the temple. So the last thing I just want to point out is, we one of the things that this book illustrates is kind of a common misconception we have about the canon. Okay, and it's just we kind of have this idea, or we sort of see our Bibles and we think, okay, so the Bible has always existed like this. It's always been neatly bound in a single book with the same font and the same spacing and the same pages, the same way of reading. Okay, and it was 500 years after Christ's birth before there was a single Bible like we would look at it and say there is a single Bible. Okay, and some would argue that it was even later than that, before it was singularly put together. Okay, and so it's one thing to look at it and say, well, in the English Bible, Malachi is the last book, and in the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament, and in the Hebrew Bible, Chronicles is the last book. Um, the bottom line is, it's an interesting question. Okay, but the order of the books isn't inspired. Okay, so it isn't, and I've heard people try to draw conclusions as, oh, well, because this is how God wanted the books in the order. No, no, the order of the books in the New Testament, the way the books are in the New Testament, is because of Jerome. Okay, Jerome, who translated the Vulgate, he said, okay, this is how we need to arrange the books in the New Testament. Okay, so you've got this Catholic priest about 400, I forget when the Vulgate was translated, 300 or 400, I think, is when he did it. You got this guy said, this is how we should do it. So, we really could have a Bible where Chronicles is the first book. Okay, I mean, so there's a certain logic to how it's done with in the English Bible, and there's a certain logic to how it's done in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, and both of them are valid. Neither one of them is inspired. Okay, and so again, and it's interesting to think that we think, oh, well, Chronicles, Kings, yeah, great, but somebody looked at that and said, something's missing. Something's missing, and we need to make that point. All these good things that David did. David did additional good things, and so let's not talk all about these bad northern kingdoms. They don't even like our temple. We're not even going to bother with. Let's focus on the temple. Let's look at what David did. If it weren't for David, the temple would not have been built as quickly as it was, because David did all of the. David, again, moved the furniture away from the walls, laid out the drop cloth, brought the ladder out, and did all of that um, for them. All right. Any questions? Any questions on Chronicles?
Sounds like you're watching two different news channels. You got First and Second Samuel and Kings, and then Chronicles.
Right.
Different view.
Right. Yeah, it is. It is, and they're complementary. The one doesn't contradict the other. There are some things in Chronicles where there are some issues between Chronicles and Samuel. The one we talked about in Samuel having to do with the numbering of the people. That in Samuel, near the end of Samuel, David goes out and numbers, and the text says that God told David, go number the people. And in Chronicles, telling the same story, it says Satan told David to go number the people. Okay, and we talked about that, right? We all remember that at that point, it could be that Satan. We don't exactly know. I mean, there's kind of trying to understand. I mean, this is the text of both. Samuel's like God said it. In Chronicles, it's Satan that said it. Uh, But if you think about Satan in the Old Testament, Satan in the Old Testament was not necessarily the individual, the fallen angel that we talk about in the New Testament. Okay, Satan was a position. It was the Hasatan, the adversary, And so in Job, when we, the idea that it was Satan, the word there, the Hebrew word is the accuser, and this was a role. Okay, so it is conceivable and consistent with the text to say that that there's an angel whose job it is to kind of be, again, this is the wrong way to put it, but the devil's advocate, sort of say, okay, are you sure about this? So there's and if you understand that going back to Job helps to uncover or to deal with the thing is like, oh, well, wait a minute. Why are God and Satan up there in heaven having a conversation? Isn't Satan evil? Kind of thing was, okay, it isn't Satan the character, or the individual, the fallen angel, it's the adversary kind of thing. Okay, and so remember we talked Asahel, right? Ahithophel, one of David's nephews is giving David's grief because he's not killing Shimei, and David turns to him and said, "Who made you Satan today?" It's the same word. Who made you the adversary? Who made you the accuser today? Who gave you that role? Okay, so you could say, looking at it from that way, comparing how it's used in Job versus how it's used in Samuel versus how it's used in Kings, you could say, looking at the actual event, later on they realized, okay, looking back, the author looking back saying, oh, wait a minute, that kind of looks like God did that, but God only did that God only encouraged us or incited David in the same way that God punished Job. Okay, did God punish Job? Or did God allow that to happen? Okay, and so we know Job, we know the story because we talked about it, kind of thing. Am I making myself clear? How that's one of the differences, again, looking back saying, okay, let's clarify that, just so people don't think that God's out there causing this kind of stuff. Yes.
Like when Jesus said, "Get behind me, Satan."
At that point,
saying, I
no,
know it's not Hebrew.
yeah. No, I think by that point it's the individual fallen angel. So I think
Okay.
yeah, to me, I mean, it could be, because again,
That one to me makes more sense to be just accused.
yeah, it could be. That's a good thought. But usually by the New Testament, when they talk, and certainly when when Paul talks about the prince of the power of the air, he's talking about the fallen angel that we call Satan. That it has become a proper noun, whereas before it was a position kind of thing. All right, next week we're going to talk about Ezra and Nehemiah. They're both books together, okay? Because in the Hebrew Bible, they're a single book, kind of thing, talking mostly about the how the temple, the return, and all that. So, all right, thank you very much. Have a great day, and we'll see you next week.